Great. So lots of parents in the house today and learning support professionals as well. So a real mix, which is great. And I'll make sure I speak to both sides of that when I'm talking to the slide. So thank you so much. Next one is a little test. Get us started. There's don't worry, it's all completely anonymous. But I would like you to name as many of the stages of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you can remember. Now you can just pop them into the dialog box there and then press enter, and then you can enter another one. So if you thought that one of the stages was beginning, then you would put that in there and then you could press enter and then it would come up. Okay, so we've got belonging there coming up as one of them. Yes, that is definitely one of them. Love, and that comes alongside belonging actually in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So love and belonging. Food, water, yeah, our physiological needs. Perfect, yes. What else have we got there? Safety, yeah. Housing, warmth, that comes along with our physiological needs as well. Yep, we've got our kind of actualization, which comes at the top of the pyramid. And then we've got our kind of self-esteem that comes in the middle of there. And we can't reach our growth as human beings, according to Maslow, unless we have met all the rest of those needs underneath it. And we'll come to the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy, but I want you to be holding it in mind as you go through this. And if Maslow is something you've never heard of before, do not worry, because I'll take you through the whole process. But I just wanted to start off by planting that seed of thinking about things in terms of a theory that's been around since the 1940s, around the importance of love and belonging in order to reach growth. So thank you so much for contributing to that. So just a quick introduction to myself. So my name is Victoria Bagnall. I'm one of the co-founders of Connections in Mind. We're a community interest company dedicated to raising awareness about executive functioning. I have a diagnosis of dyslexia, although maybe today I would have been given a diagnosis of executive function disorder. I'm not sure I like the word disorder, but that's what tends to be given out for diagnoses. Despite all my challenges with my neurodiversity and my neurodivergent traits, I managed to get to the University of Cambridge to read geography, and then went on after a little foray into the food industry to work as a teacher. Did my PGC in secondary geography, so I'm a qualified teacher. I'm also the mother of 3 gorgeous girls. I've got a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, and an 11-year-old. As I mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Connections in Mind, and also an organisation called The Code, which offers executive function aware tutoring as well. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about my light bulb moment, because at Connections in Mind, we believe that there is a point in everyone's lives, I hope, but in people who've been touched by our work's lives, where they find out about executive functioning, and suddenly a lot of the challenges that they face or that people that they support face come into focus. And it helps them to see the world in a new light. Now, my light bulb moment came when I was supporting a young lady who scored the highest ever score on the thinking skills assessment for Oxford. So she was super bright, but she really struggled, excuse me, she really struggled to do the mechanics of learning, like revision, writing essays, keeping her bag in order. It was always just like a whole load of worksheets kind of stuck to the bottom. And it was very confusing to everyone around her because she was so bright, but she seemed so unable to do these basic things. And I was working alongside a psychiatrist on this particular case because she was really struggling with her mental health as a result of what I now know as her executive function challenges, because she didn't know who she was. Was she this very bright young lady, or was she the young lady that was always forgetting things and didn't seem to be very organized? And the psychiatrist recommended this book. And I read this book and I just didn't put it down. It was my light bulb moment. I was like, this is this young lady, but not only is this young lady, this was me as well when I was a young person growing up, and me still today. And this book is written, co-authored by Dr. Peg Dawson, who has since become my mentor. I jumped on the first plane after I read the book over to America and went to one of her trainings and asked her to come to the UK and train the first cohort of executive function coaches back in 2015. And she did, because she's a wonderful, generous person she is, and has since become my mentor. So she's one of those wonderful people who's always at the end of an email to answer questions and to throw some ideas around. And we're actually doing a piece of research with the University of Houston at the moment together, which is phenomenal. And our mission at Connections in Mind is just a small one. We have the ambition to change the world because we believe that by spreading the word about executive functions and about the different brain states that we have, we can help people to be kinder to themselves and to those around them. So compassion is one of the key aims of our work. So I know that we've got some people here. I've seen some names from previous talks and probably got some newbies as well. So if you could tell me a little bit about your knowledge about executive functions. So just using menti.com again, so back to the same page you were on before. Just rate your knowledge. Have you never heard of executive functions before, or do you see yourself as an expert? Great. Super. So as a geographer, I love a graph. And this distribution shows us that there are a few people who've never heard of executive functions before. So those of you that are to consider yourself to be more expert or to have kind of a little bit of a knowledge, then please do bear with me as I go over some of the basics to make sure that everyone can be learning at the same level. So thank you so much for that, everybody. So what are executive functions? Well, executive functions are the cognitive processes, which means the brain processes, which reside in the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is the bit of our brain behind our forehead. And they're responsible for the effective and timely execution of tasks and emotional regulation. So they're kind of like the CEO of the brain. They help us to get things done, to organize ourselves. And if you have the dubious honor of sitting next to me at a dinner party, you will have your ear bent about executive functions, because I love talking to anyone who'll listen about them. And what people often say to me when I'm rabbiting on about the importance of learning more about our brains is, well, if this is so important, why don't we all know about it? Why isn't this something that everybody knows about, that we're taught about at school, that GPs and nurses and teachers and everyone, key workers, knows about? And that's because it's a really new science. Neuroscience itself is a very, very new science. And it's because we haven't really been able to look at the brain and see what the brain's doing in a live person before the advent of fMRI scanners. And before we had that, we could look at, brain damage to a particular area of the brain and what that was impacting, and we could kind of deduce what parts of the brain did what. But now we have the fMRI scanner, we can look more closely at what's going on inside the brain and we can evaluate that. So this is new science. And also neuroscientists aren't very good at PR. They're not very good at communicating what they've learned about the brain to the general public. And so the role of organizations like Connections in Mind is to help to disseminate that information into a digestible way, because believe you me, reading a neuroscience paper is not very easy to digest. And so that's the role of the work that we do. And the important thing to remember, as I will prove hopefully in a couple of slides' time, is that every single person on this planet has a unique executive function fingerprint, and everyone can benefit from working on their executive functions. So what does it actually mean? Executing tasks, what does that mean? Well, it means all these kind of things, like meeting deadlines, prioritizing which work to be completed when, regulating our emotions, inhibiting our responses, which means stopping ourselves from doing things we might instinctually want to do, like reaching for another piece of chocolate or hitting someone when they say something mean to us. Organizing our belongings, so that's kind of tidiness. Organizing our thoughts on paper, so writing essays, writing exams, writing letters. Holding information in our heads, so that's our working memory. Keeping time, which is a really interesting one because time itself is a cultural construct. If you travel around the world, you'll see that different cultures value time and punctuality in different ways. In the West, we value it very, very highly. In Africa and the Middle East, not so much. And so we need to remember that when we're thinking about time and working with young people. And the final one is thinking flexibly, the ability to shift our thinking and our attention to different things. And Ruth was just showing some of that just before we got started with trying to talk to us and do something on the tech at the same time. It's really difficult to do two things at once. Human beings are not set up to do two things at once. So what you're doing is shifting your attention between two tasks. And there are some people called super shifters. who can do that really, really well and really, really easily, and others of us, the majority of us, who can't. And so superstition is about 2% of the population. So multitasking is not something that humans naturally do. So be kind to yourself next time you think, oh gosh, why can't I just do 2 things at once? So I want to have a think about which of these challenges do you, and I'm not going to say your children this time, let's just do some self-reflection now. Which of these challenges do you struggle with? And you can choose as many as you like. And it's going to create a little donut for us in the middle here. I always love seeing these come up because even in the adult population, across the board, all of these come up. So I think it just really illustrates, doesn't it, how everyone has some challenges somewhere, and then everyone could benefit from working on these things. So we've got there, regulating our emotions coming out the highest. Yes, because being human is about being an emotional being. And if you follow Brené Brown, the work of Brené Brown, which I do, I think she's wonderful, you will know that she says that human beings are feeling beings that think and not thinking beings that feel. And I think it's really important that we remember that as educators, that we are feeling beings that think, not thinking beings that feel. And so it's no surprise to me that regulating our emotions comes out high there, because they are involved in everything that we do. Holding information in our heads, working memory, that's come up very high too, meeting deadlines. But across the board, the only one that seems to be quite low on this one is organizing belongings. Interesting that that's my one that I really struggle with, tidiness. I really struggle with that. But it's so interesting how different people have strengths and challenges in these areas. So hopefully that illustrates that beautifully. So last time you struggled with the things that we just had on the slide before, what emotions did you feel? So this is going to hopefully create a lovely word cloud for us of those emotions. And I think you can put in more than one. Okay. So interesting. And we do this talk and this word cloud with people from around the world, and from different cultures and from different jobs. You know, I go into the City of London, I do this with bankers, and I do it with teachers, and I do it with children, and I do it with the university lecturers, and it always comes out the same. These really, really strong emotions that we feel when our prefrontal cortex lets us down, especially frustration, that always comes out top, but also anger, shame, feeling out of control, like you want to give up, ashamed again, useless, upset, sad, really strong, difficult emotions that are difficult to process. So I'm interested to think, just reflect now and think about what is the root cause of those emotions, because believe you me, when you're a newborn baby and you don't have any executive functions because your prefrontal cortex isn't even started developing yet, you don't have any shame or frustration when you have to cry to get your mother's needs, get your needs met by your mother or your carer. So where does these feelings of frustration, anger, and shame come from? Where do they come from? Where's the root cause of it? Yeah, feeling like you're a failure, that really strong feeling of failure. Yeah, comes from fear, a place of real fear that you're going to let yourself down, let somebody else down, your own internal expectations. Yeah, feeling like you should be strong enough. From other people's expectations. Yeah, comparing ourselves to others. They managed to do it. Why can't I do it? Yeah, it comes from perfectionism. Comparing ourselves to others, need to be the mature one. Yeah, you need to hold this space. These are adult skills. These are adult things that I can do, and I shouldn't. My brain shouldn't let myself down. Knowing what needs to be done. So yes, there's a gap between knowing what needs to be done and doing it. Really remember that one when you're working with young people. It's really, really important. Need to show kids how to behave, that modeling, yeah, really important. But where does it come from? All these things, where do these I need to do this, I should do this, all these kind of very strong obligations that we have, where do they come from? What's the root of it? Our own expectations, but where do those expectations come from? Because you're not born with them, right? They don't develop. Society, thank you very much. Yeah, society. It comes from society. And we live in a society which has a really strong unconscious bias against people who have executive function challenges, a really strong unconscious bias against that. From school behavior policies to exam curriculum, to the fines that you get for not completing your tax return on time, or for paying the congestion charge. All these things are set up to discriminate against those people who struggle with these things. Not knowingly, because it's so embedded in our society and our culture that it's there. But that's because we always used to think that these things were character flaws. But now we know, now the neuroscience is showing us that it's not a character flaw at all. It's just a difference in development of our brains. And I'm going to go on to talk more about what causes that difference in a moment. So thanks for that. It's quite deep. Thank you so much for contributing towards that. So let's get more onto the neuroscience now. So there are three core brain functions. So we've got cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift and change our thinking depending on new information that comes to light or new tasks that we need to do. Inhibitory control, that's the ability to stop ourselves from doing things that we might otherwise want to do instinctually. And the third one is working memory. That's the ability to hold information in our heads whilst we're doing complex tasks. Now, these three core brain functions cross over in real life to present with these measurable skills that we can kind of put our finger on and say, okay, yes, this is a skill associated with executive functioning. So all 11 of these executive function skills are associated with that part of the brain, and you need to have a well-developed prefrontal cortex in order to do these things. So you'll see we've got flexibility, we've got response inhibition and working memory. So those map directly onto the cognitive functions, but we've also got skills such as organization, which is our ability to keep things tidy. We've got goal-directed persistence, which is the same as resilience or grit. We've got emotional regulation. We've got time management. We've got sustained attention, task initiation, which is the opposite of procrastination, if I could get my words out. Planning and prioritization, which also pulls in like filtering out what information to put in an essay, filtering out what's a salient part of a conversation and not getting distracted off into another topic of conversation because a new thought comes into our heads. And also, and very importantly, metacognition. And metacognition is one of the latest executive function skills to develop. It doesn't develop until our late 20s. And yet we often expect young people to have the same metacognition abilities, the ability to self-evaluate, the ability to look at our behavior and the way it impacts other people and take note of that. And in order to be metacognitive, you need all three executive functions. You need, firstly, your working memory in order to remember what happened. Then you need your response inhibition to kind of stop and think, okay, I'm going to analyze what happened. And then you need your cognitive flexibility to think about what happened from somebody else's perspective or from a different perspective rather than your emotional perspective. Okay, so you can see how all of these 11 executive function skills require a little bit of those three brain functions, some more than others. And those are the ones that we can measure, and those are the ones that we can consciously and actively develop. There's also been a load of research, and if anyone's interested, please do write to me about this, but I've got a massive long reading list about the impact of executive function skills on learning. So it's not just about the mechanics of learning, like not calling out in class and being able to be self-reflective and writing essays and revision and homework and exams, but it's also just maths. Maths requires a lot of working memory. You cannot be good at maths if you struggle with working memory. Writing essays, you need lots of planning and prioritization skills for that. So there's a lot of executive function skills that are embedded in what the requirements we have for young people in learning. but they aren't explicitly taught. And I feel that that is quite unfair, but that's only because I know that there's a different way of doing these things. So it's really, really interesting to see how much executive functions are wrapped up in learning. But it's also really important to remember that executive function challenges and differences in our executive function are caused by two things, neither of which a child has any control over, or an adult for that matter. So the research has shown there's a genetic predisposition, so it's very heritable. If you struggle with executive function challenges, then your children are very likely to too. Now, there's also a lot of research about the impact of, and this is very recent research, the impact of psychological trauma, whether it's acute or chronic. So acute is like abuse and neglect and things like that, but chronic can be more like bullying or not feeling understood, or not having kind of strong connections with people over time. So that trauma has been shown to impact the development of the brain to the extent that there's different brain architecture for children who've experienced psychological trauma. So we can see from the work of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child and a lot of American universities that are working in this particular area, we can see brain scans of children who've experienced trauma in their formative years, where the prefrontal cortex is smaller, and the amygdala, where the fight, flight, or freeze response, where that emotional response is enlarged. So the architecture of the brain is different, and it's shaped differently. So no child or adult, for that matter, has control over whether they have executive function challenges or not. But as we've just illustrated from our lovely word cloud there, we feel these really strong emotions because society is telling us we should feel ashamed, we should feel guilty, we should feel unlovable, we should be full of fear, we should feel hopeless and isolated. And those emotions are what causes the behaviors that we see on the surface. So you might see swearing, you might see rule breaking, you might see emotional outbursts, you might see them forgetting things easily, or shouting out in class, or being disruptive. Or it might just be that they're just never completing the homework. They seem to be, learning pretty well in the lesson, but they're just not doing the homework. Or they may do really well verbally in lesson, just really struggle to get it down on paper. And the majority of the time, these children are actually really quiet and compliant at school. The teachers have no idea what is going on for them, because they are complying with everything that they've been told they need to do to protect themselves. But they're explosive at home, where they have a lot of sense of belonging and connection. They can be themselves, because it's so exhausting to try and keep up with your peers and try and comply when you really struggle with these things. And so you can see from this diagram that if we're thinking that a child is choosing these behaviors at the top, we're not getting to the root of what's going on. But when we can understand that these kind of behaviors are caused by a difference in the brain architecture, which has nothing to do with the child's choice, then it's not their fault in any way, then I think we can be more compassionate towards those children and help them to develop in an understanding and kindness towards themselves, to get rid of this shame and fear and hopelessness that they feel in the middle, which should then reduce down their behaviors. And we'll come on to more of that in a minute. So I just want to recognize that a lot of people with executive function challenges have developed some quite difficult avoidance behaviors that can be very challenging to deal with. So often we find that people with executive function challenges are very adept at thinking on their feet and making up white lies about why they haven't done something. And that can seem very manipulative. We also can find that they tend to be really charming and, can be the class clown, or just really super engaging and lovely in classes, so that you don't really notice that they haven't done the homework, or they haven't engaged in the piece of work that you were doing when it was written, because they did so well in the verbal piece. And so what we have to remember is that a child and any developing brain will work to keep itself safe. And so what children are developing is these avoidance behaviors from getting told off, or feeling that shame and fear and guilt, by making up lies, or being charming, or doing whatever keeps them safe. And in psychology, we call this maladaptive coping strategies, because often what happens is that these coping strategies backfire eventually. The white lies that then turn into, you can't trust that child, they're not trustworthy, or the anxiety that has you kind of on hyper alert all the time. What have I forgotten? What have I forgotten? I need to go through my list, 10 times to make sure I've got everything. That coping strategy that then turns into an anxiety disorder later on. So it's really important to remember what can be really frustrating avoidance behaviors are normally a maladaptive coping mechanism for that feeling of fear and shame and hopelessness that young people are feeling. Just quickly mention the link, and I won't stay too much on this, but the link between executive functions and neurodivergent traits. So there's a really strong link between executive functions and ADHD. In fact, some people say that they could be interchangeable terms, and this is Professor Russell Barkley. There's also a really strong link with dyslexia as well, and they talk here about it as being a shared deficit underpinning all neurodevelopmental disorders, and also for autism spectrum disorder as well. So there's a lot of evidence about the links between executive functioning and these various different traits, neurodivergent traits. And whilst this is simplifying things massively, and every single child has a unique, and adult for that matter, have a unique profile and then unique needs that need to be met, it's quite interesting to think about it in terms of 3 brain functions. So with cognitive flexibility, that's the ability to shift and change our thinking. You can kind of match that onto autistic traits quite a lot, because that black and white thinking, difficulty when plans change and things like that, so difficulty shifting. Then with the inhibitory control, that's very much around the ADHD traits, around, not being able to sustain attention for a long time, not being able to resist impulses. And then finally, we've got dyslexic traits, and that tends to be more around the working memory, and that definitely rings true with myself. And I know I haven't yet to find a young person who has a dyslexia diagnosis that doesn't also have working memory challenges too. And some of the research says that's because what we're looking at is the phonological working memory. I can't get into all of these details now because I want to focus on connection. But it's really, really interesting to see where some of the research in this is going. And again, the brain is a very complex organ, and I am simplifying things here, but it's very interesting to see how these things map across. So we're talking a bit now and going on to the connection piece and the importance of brain development and connection. I have covered it a bit already, but we're going to get more into the depth now. So I'm going to again simplify the brain again, and I have to do this in order to make it approachable and easier to digest. So please, you do be aware that the brain is a very complex organ, but we're going to be talking about 3 key areas of the brain that we're concerned with at the moment in terms of the brainstem. That's the part of our brain that's responsible for kind of our heart rate and our breathing and our sleep. Our limbic system, which is specifically the amygdala, and that fight, flight, or freeze response that you probably would have heard of. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex, the bit we've been talking about, the executive functions, which sit over the top there behind the forehead. And I'm going to show you this nifty hand model of the brain, which is really useful. So if you want to learn this, just pop your hand up, and it's always good to be kind of multi-central when you're doing this. Sensory, sorry, not central. That's a totally different thing. So if you've got your brainstem here, which is the wrist area, then you fold your thumb across your fingers like that. Now that's that knobbly bit of your thumb that sticks out. That's your amygdala. And then you've got your prefrontal cortex here. And there's your cortex, and there's your prefrontal cortex, which sits over the top of the amygdala. Now, what the prefrontal cortex job is to regulate the amygdala. Okay, but then the amygdala can hijack the prefrontal cortex, because we are feeling beings that think. Okay, we do the thinking last, the feeling first. So everything kind of has to go, everything we experience has to go through the amygdala, and then it allows the prefrontal cortex to do its work if it feels it's safe. And so when the amygdala feels that it's not safe, it hijacks the brain and it says, prefrontal cortex, off you go, don't need you right now, in fight, flight, or freeze, you're not useful. So it flips its lid. The prefrontal cortex is neurologically not connected to the amygdala and not doing the work that it can do. And you can see that there's this thing called the frontoamygdala connection, and you can see that in brain scans, that if you're in fight, flight, or freeze, the prefrontal cortex isn't able to do its kind of thinking work and make rational decisions at that stage. And so this flipping the lid is a really great way to speak to young people about what's going on for them when they're triggered, when they're emotionally dysregulated. But also they don't have to be emotionally dysregulated and lying on the floor, you know, in an emotional disarray to be dysregulated. So they can be super anxious, they can be struggling to pay attention, there can be all sorts of different things that are going on for them that can show us they're dysregulated. So that having a tantrum, and I use that in inverted commas because I don't like that term, is just one manifestation of dysregulation. There are many, many more. But if you think about the fight, or freeze is the way of kind of rationalizing that. Again, I'm oversimplifying things, but hopefully that kind of resonates. And this is a great way. We use this at home all the time in my family, between my husband and myself, between myself and my children, between the children themselves, talking about what happens and using those words to talk about being dysregulated and doing things that we wouldn't rationally normally do otherwise. But when we think about the hand model of the brain like that, and think of the brain as kind of like a muscle, and that the more you use a part of the brain, the bigger it becomes, the more neurological connections there are in there, and the more myelinated those connections become. And myelination is a process by which the neurons have this fatty layer that grows around them, but it basically means that it becomes easier to do the things that you do most regularly. That's why habits can become easier the more you do them. So when we remember that the brain is like a muscle, it follows that if you experience excessive stress when you're a child and you're living in your fight, flight, or freeze part of your brain, and your amygdala has kind of hijacked the brain and the prefrontal cortex isn't allowed to come online, that the amygdala will become enlarged and the prefrontal cortex will be smaller. Okay, and that is what the Harvard Center for the Developing Child has found. So the more a child is in that state of dysregulation, the more likely they are to be in that state of dysregulation. And it's our job as parents and as practitioners to help those children to regulate themselves. And to learn and to be in that regulated state more than they're in the dysregulated state, so that the brain can develop optimally. And even affects us as adults. So we'll all remember COVID, one of the most traumatic experiences of our adult lives. And that excessive stress had an impact on the majority of us who really struggled to get basic things done. And that's because we were experiencing stress and our prefrontal cortex wasn't allowed to do its work. We were living in our fight, flight, or freeze part of our brains. Now, poor teachers had to work in that environment, and they had to educate the nation, which was really very unfair to have to do that. But we had to be masters of engaging our prefrontal cortex in that time. We didn't have the luxury of being able to sit back on the sofa and think how dreadful this is. And so it's very interesting to see how the more you're used to using your prefrontal cortex as a child, the more you're able to recover from traumatic experiences when you're an adult too. So teachers, by definition, to have got through academia and education high enough to get a degree and to be able to teach, have to have exhibited strong executive functions through that. So they will have a large enough prefrontal cortex to be able to engage in that way. And I don't want to get too much into the details there, but it's really, really interesting to think about, you know, people who were struggling more in those times. And those people were probably affected more by the stress and the, having their prefrontal cortex disconnected from the rest of their brain when they're feeling stressed. So moving on to connection now. So you're probably thinking, well, on earth, there's all this trauma. How does that link into connection? But from the research, what we found is that if you think of trauma being the kind of the thing that causes the suboptimal brain development in terms of the prefrontal cortex, and then you think of what the opposite of trauma is, and that's a feeling of connection with people who love you, a feeling of belonging, then you can see where that starts to come in. And I'm going to build on that in a minute. But there's also all these other things as well, and it's really important to remember them. So we've got safety there, that's psychological safety and physical safety. We've got exercise, bringing oxygen to the brain so that it can function optimally. We've got feelings of fun and joy, really important for brain development. Calm, that's mindfulness, yoga, etc. Sleep and food as well, are all important parts of strong executive functioning and brain functioning. So I'd like you to think about the last instance of when these factors impacted your ability to be organized. So when did your sleep or lack of food or lack of connection or safety impact your ability to kind of be organized in a way that you would normally be? Maybe you were late to something, maybe you became dysregulated and said something you regretted later. My children, in fact, I do too, experience hangry a lot, and that is because lack of food means that we're dysregulated. So lack of sleep, can't function on a very simple level. Yeah, absolutely. Today, yesterday, probably tomorrow. Yes, it's very human, isn't it? Any more ideas on that? Yeah. Could not find my keys anywhere, rushing, yeah, lack of sleep. And the more that we panic, the more dysregulated we become, the less likely we are to be able to think rationally, to be able to find the keys, right? So it then spirals. Couldn't focus on work, as tired. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. These are all great responses. Thank you so much for that. So it applies to us all. And just think about our building blocks. So we do this a lot with organizations that we go and train. And I often say to managers, take a look at this, need to need to work on some of these things. But I'd like to just have a bit of a group reflection now on how our building blocks are doing today as adults. Almost just back after half term, if you're parents. How are they doing today? Okay, well, the first few coming in. Okay, people feeling safe. Most of us are at home, so that's good. Exercise, kind of middling. Connection, less than half. Fun, way down. 2.8, folks. That's not good. Joy, close second to last there. Calm, sleep, and food's looking pretty good too. This is pretty typical graph that we tend to see from these kind of results. We're not looking after our brains enough as a society. We're not doing the things that the neuroscience has showed will help us. So exercise, connection, fun, joy, calm, sleep, really lacking across the board here. So just something to note, something to reflect on. We use this in our Connected Club, which is our kind of support group that we have for people who are neurodivergent, who want to work on their executive function skills. And we do this as a reflection every time we meet, just to put a little barometer on how things are going. And if you're a teacher, you can use this in sessions with students, get them to fill out a little graph. How are they doing on these things? Then you know what you're dealing with. Because if they're low on any of these things, you're going to be having an uphill struggle to get them to learn. And so you might want to do something that's fun and joyful at the beginning of your sessions, just to keep that ticking over. You can't do much about sleep in school, though. So that's a tricky one. So thanks so much for that. So why is connection so key to personal development? Well, it is, and I'm going to go into talk more about why the neuroscience shows us that. And this all comes down to Stephen Porges, and there are many other theories as well, but the polyvagal theory that I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. And it's the idea of neuroception. And neuroception is that our whole neural circuits in our whole body distinguish whether, say, situations and people are safe or dangerous or life-threatening from the moment we walk into an environment. And so when we are in a situation where we feel safe, then we are able to learn. But if we're with people or in situations where we don't feel safe, we're in fight, flight, or freeze, or we're in the fear and shutdown parts of our brain. And you can go away and read much more about polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve and how we can stimulate the vagus nerve. But key things that are really important to do with music, just humming or singing is really important, dance, but things that make us feel safe and feel a sense of belonging, allow us to access our prefrontal cortex so that we can engage in learning. And it's a really important part of the work that we do at Connections in Mind. And so let's just think now about how this impacts students in the school environment. And I've picked the school environment because it's kind of across the board, most children are in school of some sort of description. So what we tend to find in schools, and not all schools have this, but most schools have behaviour policies that involve some kind of punishment or isolation if a child misbehaves or exhibits challenging behaviour, or what I prefer to call distressed behaviour, because actually it is distressed behaviour. They are dysregulated, and I think it's a much better way of putting it. But when they exhibit this distressed behaviour, they have these feelings of the neuroception tells them that they are not safe. It tells them that they should feel that they're in danger, or they should be feeling really fearful, and they feel unwanted, alone, and misunderstood. They become dysregulated. They're living in their amygdala, and then there's more unexpected behavior. And so we have this vicious spiral of trying to correct what we see as unwanted behavior within school environments. And we even see it in the home too. When we punish, it actually makes things worse rather than improving it. And so what we need to do is we need to co-regulate, and we'll come on to a bit more about that in a moment. So here are some of the case studies just to illustrate my point. So we've got Susie here. So she's got a diagnosis of ASD, and she really struggles with her flexibility and metacognition, which is very common with ASD profiles. The teacher implements a behaviour policy, and Susie feels it's really unfair. She's got that black and white thinking, and she feels, no, that's really unfair. I don't feel that I should be punished for this. She's triggered, and she mutters something under her breath because she knows she's not supposed to, but she can't control herself. The teacher then becomes emotionally triggered. So they're both kind of flip their lids up here. And the teacher questions Susie's behaviour. What did you say? And Susie loses control of her behaviour. She throws a chair across the room, and the teacher escalates according to the behaviour policy. Now you can see how this is completely spiraled out of control. And if the teacher had the foresight to be able to understand that Susie, because of her ASD, might be triggered by this, and to co-regulate at that point, we could have undone the spiral and it wouldn't have escalated. Now the next one is George. So George has ADHD and inhibitory control challenges, so minor misdemeanors such as chewing gum or wearing the wrong shoes or chatting in class. And he gets these things at his school, they're called strikes. So when you exhibit the unexpected behavior, then you get these strikes. And these strikes accumulate because no one's thought to teach George how to stop doing these things. And he hasn't got any strategies. And so they accumulate into detention. Then he has to do this reflective essay. And George is, not so keen on the reflective essay. It doesn't have the desired effect because he doesn't really see why it's not important, or is important, that he doesn't chew gum, etc. These detentions accumulate, and eventually the school threatens him with suspension, all because of minor misdemeanors like chewing gum in class, handing in homework late, all these little minor things that are definitely not suspendable offences on their own, but they accumulate together. Then we've got Kit. Now he has no formal diagnosis. He struggles with sustained attention, time management, and task initiation challenges. He's charming in class. So he's one of these ones that has developed lots of charm and really strong verbal ability, but he's chronically late. He's always disheveled and always has an excuse for why he hasn't done things. He performs well in tests, but he could do better. but he's really given the benefit of doubt at primary school because he's got that one teacher who in each year really love him, think he's great. But when he gets to secondary school, he's got all these different teachers, they're strict on the behavior policies, and these strikes and detentions accumulate. And he has this really that crisis of confidence. Am I this naughty boy who's always in trouble, or am I this likable person that I was in primary school? And then finally we've got Emily, and Emily doesn't have a diagnosis either, but she really struggles with her metacognition, flexibility, and working memory. And she often makes these really out of place comments and struggles to make friends. She sits alone at playtimes and the other girls tease her about her shoes. She seems engaged in school, but she's not reaching her potential. And parents report there's a struggle to get her into school. Often she's in tears in the car in the morning. So here are just some of the case studies of children with executive function challenges who, through no fault of their own, really struggle in these areas. And I want to kind of bring this back now to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I kind of quizzed you on at the beginning. So just reminding ourselves that we've got physiological safety at the bottom, then we've got physiological needs at the bottom, then we've got safety. So that's in terms of financial safety and just feeling in balance and in control. Then we've got love and belonging, really important to remember that. Then we've got esteem, and then we have self-actualization. We can only reach self-actualization when all of these needs are met. Okay, so this is Maslow back in the 1940s. And it maps very strongly onto our pyramid that you'd have seen in the building blocks that the neuroscience is showing is important too. So how are our case studies doing? How are Susie and George and Kit and Emily doing in terms of these needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Okay. Really interesting to see these answers coming through. So yeah. Whilst you can see the kind of in the background, the graph of like the different distribution of answers, you can see that the graph is very much showing that, yes, while the physiological needs are probably being met, the safety needs are really not being met, the love and belonging either, and this esteem certainly not. And so these children are not getting what they need in order for their brains to develop optimally. And they're experiencing a lot of shame every day and frustration that their prefrontal cortex lets them down. And they're not getting the help that they need. And our work is around helping educate professionals, the parents, and individuals themselves to be more compassionate about these challenges and to find ways to ensure that every child feels that they belong so that they can flourish and develop. And I don't think I need to go through this one too much, but you know, it's really important to remember that this poor self-talk that children get because they get told, you're late again, they have this poor self-image, then they perform poorly, and so it spirals down and down and down. So it's no wonder that children with the SEND really struggle with their mental health in this country. And that's because their self-talk is around these things, because they get told these things by society. They get told that they're lazy. So they believe that they're lazy. They get told that there's something wrong with them because other people can do these things. So they begin to think, what's wrong with me? They begin to think they're not timely enough or punctual enough or organized enough or whatever it is, the thing that they really struggle with, and that they don't belong in this environment. And this is the internal self-talk. And I know this because our organization works with lots of neurodivergent young people. This is the internal self-talk that so many of the young people that we care for have. But we can change it and we can bring about change. But we need to think about what is belonging, because I believe if we can focus on connection and belonging, then we can reverse this trend. Because if we have an environment where everyone focuses on belonging, then this wouldn't be allowed to happen. And we need to think of what belonging is, because a lot of people think that belonging is like fitting in, and it's something that a child needs to do. But actually, belonging is around this concept, which is quite difficult to pin down. So I'm going to try and explain it. So equality is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. But belonging is dancing like nobody's watching. Now, a lot of people take that as the child needs to just, be fine with who they are and just dance like nobody's watching. No, the institution needs to create an environment where the child can dance like nobody's watching and they can be their whole selves. And it's the responsibility of the institution, not the child. And that's really, really important. And so when we create, I thought I had another slide here. Oh, there we go. I'll come back to that other one in a minute. And we have to remember, as Brene Brown, who's, again, I'm a great fan of, says that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. But if our children are fitting in, then the school's not doing it right. And so we need to have this sense of belonging. We need to have this focus on belonging in our schools. And when we have that, and we have a sense of understanding around these challenges, around our executive functions or around different ethnic origins and different genders and different sexualities, then we can change the way that young people talk about themselves. And I come at this from an executive function perspective, right? So my perspective is I'm working on my skills. I am enough just how I am. It's going to take time to master them, but my teachers understand me and they support me. And that's a totally different frame of mind, a very growth mindset frame of mind that young people need in order to flourish. And when we do that, when we help young people to understand that they belong, then we bring that prefrontal cortex back online and they're able to develop their prefrontal cortex in an optimal way. So we do this through a process called Connect, Collaborate, Support. Now I'm running slightly over time, so I do apologize everyone, but I'll whiz through these slides as much as possible. So connection is really important, as I've just talked about now. Connection and belonging are fundamental to human development, and collaboration with young people is also really important. It's so important that when we focus on belonging, let's say, that we don't just run in and say, right, school, we're going to be focusing on belonging and these are all the things that we're going to do. Actually, what we need to be doing is we need to be asking young people, we want to focus on belonging. What do we need to do? So there's a great research question that you can do as a whole school, which is, does everyone in our community feel that they belong in the school? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Simple as that. And if you can work on that premise, then you can create a truly inclusive environment where everybody feels like they belong. And that's based on the work of Catherine Riley, if anyone's interested in reading more about that. And then you can support people to develop their executive function skills. And we also need to remember that a dysregulated adult cannot help a dysregulated child. So when we're doing this work, we need to remember that we need to regulate ourselves first. Remember, we're feeling beings that think. We struggle with these things too. We need to have our own toolbox of regulation techniques that we can use. It's really, really important. And we need to regulate ourselves first before we help the child, because often if we're not, we're going to say things that we regret later. So in connection, it's about empathy, about co-regulation, and co-regulation is the essence of that. A child will not have the skills yet for self-regulation. That comes when you're much older. And our role as adults is to help them to develop the skills of self-regulation through a process called co-regulation. And the key premise of co-regulation is empathy. And empathy is very different from sympathy, and a real skill that needs to be deployed within schools and within homes as well, which helps. What it does is it speaks directly to the amygdala and says, your emotions are valid, it's okay, you can let the prefrontal cortex come online and move on. Okay, and that's what empathy does. It's a very, very powerful tool, but sympathy doesn't do that because it kind of talks down to the amygdala and makes the amygdala feel even more threatened and even more misunderstood. So empathy is a really, really important tool. And then also executive function literacy as well, because if you can talk about these things at home like we do, I'm really struggling with my time management at the moment because I didn't sleep well last night. I'm going to need some help remembering to pack the car up, 15 minutes before we have to leave, and then I'm going to need everyone to help me get in the car and get going on time. This kind of things that we can talk about every day and with our children, and create a common understanding of when our prefrontal cortex lets us down. There's also some further reading for you as well. So if you found this all interesting, here are some books that you can read about, particularly about the application of this in schools. So there's a book called The Kindness Principle, which is working on relational behavior management in schools. So how we can help young people to develop self-discipline in a relational way, by Dave Whitaker, who's the head of various alternate provisions and PRUs. So I've been working with some of the country's most disadvantaged children. And then this one called Connections Over Compliance by Laurie de Soltes as well, which is very much more kind of on the neuroscience side of things. So if you're really interested in the neuroscience, then dig into that one too. And then remember, we're here to help. So we are absolutely passionate about helping schools, parents, individuals, and organisations to learn more about executive functions. So we do one-to-one coaching, we do CPD and training, and we also offer support in terms of our Connected Club, which is a kind of drop-in support group that we offer, and also a library of resources and online learning modules that you can access. And then we have accredited professional training as well. So you can learn through us to be an executive function coach. In fact, we're training 20 coaches from the University of California, Berkeley over the summer. So you'll be in great company. Obviously, they're having their own bespoke training. Yeah, we can learn to be an executive function coach. You can also do SEN professional training for professionals working within schools or alongside young people, such as tutors, Senkos, etc. And then we also work with mental health professionals as well to help them to understand executive function challenges more. And we offer 4 levels of accreditation for all of our training. So level 1 is what you get when you first do the course. And then we offer supervision and professional development as we go through the different levels until you get up to master, which is level 4. And at that stage, you're then able to go off and give talks in schools and train other people and so on and so forth. We also have lots of resources in CIMlearning.com, which has got loads of different resources and courses and things. Again, have a look at that. And you can find us on LinkedIn and Instagram. And then also we have a professional network on Mighty Networks as well. So finally, before questions, I'm sorry I've run over a little bit. I got very enthusiastic. But just to say that it's necessary for some. So this approach is absolutely necessary for some, but it'd be good for all. And I don't think there's any child that wouldn't benefit from a school that focused on that question. And I'm just going to say it again because it's very simple. Does everyone in our community feel that they belong? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Thank you very much.